Well, welcome everybody. I guess we'll get started. Very happy to have all of our guests here today, and welcome. This is the final in our series this month, this November series, which is actually extending into December because it was such a good program. This is a panel of entitled Northwest Coast Art into the Future, with some of our best up-and-coming artists and practitioners and knowledgeable people about many dimensions of art and commerce, because now today art and commerce is sort of linked. We're fortunate to have as a moderator Lance Kunai Twitchell. Twitchell. Who is assistant professor of Alaska Native Languages at the University of Alaska Southeast. He has an MFA in creative writing from UAF and has published numerous poems and short stories in several literary magazines. And he's a former UAF assistant professor of English. He teaches many things in many domains. He teaches Tlingit immersion camps for the UAS and for Sealaska Heritage Institute, and Northwest Coast Form Line for our Genet Art Academy. He recently completed a tribute film to his mentor, Richard Dauenhauer, which was very moving. And he's a practicing artist in his own right. He describes his art as modern Alaska Native style. He's a prize-winning artist in a past Celebration juried art show, and he donated items to our Tana art auction last year. So very happy to have him as our moderator today. So I'll let him speak.
Shukbayach Twasaku, Atlitko Hasio, Katangi Hwashayechi. Pinchish Hati Ati. Hastu Ani Kak, Hastu Shishk. Hastu Shishko Has Ani Kak Await Akupon, Ka Akupon. Okay Haswatian Yanyedi, Kabushki Tan, Katline di, Kayakte Hitan. Idat Kashit the Hain nach Sati Ja, ach tu klare hast du hoch Khatati, ja, the Katas hast du GET away nach Shakuzi. Thank you guys for coming. I first wanted to make a little bit of the Tlingit language before we start, or as we start, and just acknowledge the people whose ancestral home we're standing upon, the Dakuquan and the Akaquan people. And it's a real honor to be among these artists. They're extremely gifted and forward-thinking. I think they challenge a lot of things around them, and it's just really exciting. The things that they make, we call them hastuchi are amazing. So I'll give you a short biography on each of them, and then I'm going to ask them a series of questions. I wish there was like some kind of like that "Do you want to be a millionaire" type of theme music that could come after each question. But just imagine that that's happening. We laugh, we have a lot of fun, but I think that humor carries us through a lot of things and allows us to keep going. It's chish. Rico Tlanat Boro is a Tlingit at the Baskin artist who designs and produces art in the Northwest Coast formline tradition. His work explores living with traditional values today. He is also an advocate of diversity in community and promotes diversity in civic engagement. Rico designs a variety of products including skis, skateboards, playing cards, and jewelry. He is the founder and owner of Trickster Company, a business that promotes innovative indigenous design. Rico's work has been displayed at the Burke Museum, the Peabody Essex Museum, and in other venues. This summer, he will be represented in a gallery in Paris. Nicholas Galanin was born in Sitka, Alaska. He is trained extensively in traditional as well as contemporary approaches to art, and he pursues them both in parallel paths. Galanin studied at the London Guildhall University, is that right? where he received a Bachelor of Fine Arts with honors in jewelry design and silversmithing. and at the Massey University in New Zealand, earning a master's degree in Indigenous Visual Arts. Allison Bremner is an artist born and raised in Southeast Alaska. Painting, wood carving, regalia, and digital collage are a few of the mediums the artist employs. Allison has learned under master artists David Boxley and David R. Boxley. Her work is carried in the top Northwest Coast art galleries in Vancouver, BC, Victoria, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, and Southeast Alaska. In 2013, the British Museum acquired Bremner's work for their permanent collection. And David R. Boxley is a Tsimshian artist from Metlakatla, Alaska. David's elegant design style is drawn from a strong tradition of Tsimshian carving and design and has been heavily influenced by the teachings of his father and the old masters. From 2009 to 11, David carved alongside Haida artist Robert Davidson, and with his guidance, David has honed his craft to compare with the very best in Northwest Coast art. David's works are carried in major Northwest Coast art galleries in Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, Ketchikan, and Anchorage. So we have 1 hour to cover a wide variety of topics, including the answers to everything.
Solve the world's problems right here.
For people on the Northwest Coast, an hour is like a hummingbird fluttering its wings. So we're going to try to keep it. This is a snapshot of some of their thoughts. So we'll start with, I'll ask you one question. You guys can all answer it. And starting with Rico. What do you think about the state of the art today?
I think one thing I always tell a lot of visitors that stop by my shop is that it's an art form that's developed over thousands of years. You know, we spend a lot of time as a people almost in like a meditative state around this specific art form, and it's we've put a lot into it. We've really built it up to something, you know, really spectacular. And I think today there's you know, of course there was with colonization we had a lot of trauma, and so you know that comes through in the arts, whether it's a lot of our stuff being kind of collected and taken away from us, to you know how the economic strength of the artist. So I think I see it kind of like in three places. Really, some people are really focusing on that same kind of meditative path of the arts. I see some people really exploring kind of the trauma of colonization, and I see a lot of people exploring what it means to be indigenous in a modern day. So I think it's just a mix of all those three.
Okay, Cheesh. And Nick, I'll ask you the same.
The health of our culture is really portrayed through our visual language, I would say, and that's becomes apparent when we look historically at things that have gone on the land here, the displacement of community, the displacement of language and culture, etc., the breaking of our education system of master and apprentice, and these things are represented visually, perhaps, in the visual language, not so much spiritually. I would say a lot of the work that was created in early 1900s still had this significance to our culture, though a lot of that work visually was represented a little differently because of these traumas, I guess you would say. But the state of our art today, the value of that is something that I would personally say is how is it valued in our community as a way of representing what that state of our art is. So how is it valued? This building was put here recently, so that's a positive sign to me of of our culture having a house or a place to share and represent and to celebrate these arts. That Chilkat robe was brought back home here today. That's very positive plus for these conversations. We don't have a Native education degree program in our university here. That's a negative, I would say. So that there's work to be done there. These are institutions that are put in place as forms of saying, for us to succeed, we go to college. But you go to college and you have to, generally speaking, not now, the language degree program is in place, but you go to these places and you have to hang up your identity to go through these institutions to get an idea of success. I don't agree with that, and I think that there's a lot of room and space for us to grow in these conversations. So, yeah.
Excellent. Cheesh and Alice.
I came up from Seattle, and on my way here in the SeaTac airport, and I promise this has a point, Pune, so don't cut me off as soon as I say it, but in the Seattle airport, I saw a sign for an epic undergarment sale, and it got me thinking about how some words have really become so misused, you know, the word epic, the word awesome, and I think that another word that has really become misused is the term master carver. And that's not so much by our own people who say, oh, you know, we're the best, because that really goes against our cultural nature, but I see it a lot in newspaper reportings, you know, anytime a Native does anything, oh, they're a master carver. But really our ancestors set the bar so high. And it's like Rico and Nick were saying, you know, trauma and the breaking of the traditional transfer of knowledge hindered our art form for a while, so I think we have ways to go before we do have widespread mastery.
I agree with everything everyone said. I was fortunate to grow up in a home where my father was, involved in gallery shows and raised totem poles, and I got to cart along with him everywhere he went. And it's been an interesting experience over my career to see what started in the 50s and 60s with people like Mungo Martin and Bill Reed, Robert Davidson, and it, as it grew from there. And those guys, Joe David and Dempsey Bob, and those guys who created what we think of as the modern Northwest Coast art market. Galleries didn't exist when they started working. Galleries came after they started. But when they first started, they put their work in curio shops and little trading posts and things like that, or the modern, whatever the 70s equivalent was of that. They had to, create a guild just to standardize print prices. All the things that I just now am fortunate enough to, I jump into that, I'm part of that market now. So I've gotten to see the results of that. And where at the beginning of that, the reflowering of our art, there was just a handful of people. There was, each tribe had what some might call masters, others most of them would say, don't call me that. I agree with that estimation. Matter of fact, I'm teaching a form line class tonight, and I was advertised as Master Simseon artist, and I appreciate it, but that everyone's a lifetime student, and there are very few people who should receive that title of master. One of the differences now with the state of the art today is there's a ton of artists. There's a ton of people who are putting their work out there, and to be honest, and I'm brave enough to say this because I don't know if any of you got to go to my dad's talk. He said something I couldn't believe that he had the guts to say. He said, just because it's native made doesn't mean it's good. And I really thought, wow, Dad's brave. But it's the truth, and it's true with any art form. Just because somebody calls it art doesn't mean it's excellent. And it seems like right now, and this is going to fall into a question later too, but there's so much being made that the stuff that is quality, it can be on a wall with all this other stuff and gets drowned out by the amount of work there is. So that's something that's going on today. At the flip side of that, though, is with modern technology, with tracing paper, we can do things with the art that the old masters just couldn't have done. Designs are symmetrical now. You look at the old pieces, and it didn't matter that they weren't. But, one side of a pound and a half of a Bentwood box, if you flip it over, it doesn't match up with the other side, even though it looks like it does. So there's things we've been able to improve on. The biggest thing with the state of the art today, I believe, is that there's not enough focus on beginners learning from the old masters. I see it in everything everywhere I go. The foundation that comes from learning from the old masters is what allowed people like Robert Davidson to do what they're doing today. And we're at a point where we're competing with the modern world while living in the modern world and building an identity as contemporary Native people while at the same time recovering from that trauma. It's a very peculiar, challenging time to be doing what we're doing. It's a challenge every day, but it's the kind of challenge I think we're all up for.
Okay. Sheesh. The term modern is very interesting.
Yeah.
We'll get to some things like that. From the perspective of someone who's advocating for language revitalization, especially Indigenous language revitalization, we hear things like, oh, but we've got to prepare the kids for the modern global economy or the real world. And so those are some things that just say, well, you guys aren't modern or real,
right,
or global. And so it's always interesting to see how those things, just the manipulation of language within our conversation. So question number 2, starting with Nick. What do you think could help strengthen Northwest Coast Native art?
Give us our land back. That would strengthen our art immensely. For real. No, we are connected, though. We're connected to this place. We're connected to this space. We're connected to our relationship with the land. Our art is, our language is, the way we familiarize and survive. But also opportunity, providing space for opportunity to succeed. Again, like I said earlier, in our relationships with other institutions, universities, etc. Access. A lot of the early scholars of Northwest Coast art were not from our community, and they had access to, again, these old objects that we talk about, the atu, or the cultural objects in these spaces. And having our own perspectives within our own community, telling our stories, is key when we look at how haphazardly that had been done historically when non-Indigenous anthropologists were in charge of creating and documenting our history through their homogenized lens, our perspective. All of these things. And just on the smallest level, supporting each other, going out and supporting a young Native artist that's trying to learn. Teach them. Show them, if you're an artist. Give them everything that you needed when you were learning and trying to learn as an artist, because those are the other artists that are going to be out there doing work in the communities. So.
Sheesh. Allison.
What I think could help strengthen Northwest Coast art, I have a twofold answer to that. I think the surface answer would be, like David R. was saying earlier, a focus on learning from the old pieces and the old masters. I think the answer that lies under the surface, in my perspective, is that we say that art, and every artist says this, that our art isn't just art, it's a visual link to our culture. And I agree with that, and it's very simplified, and also very simplified, our language was and is, the sound of our culture. So there we have what our culture looked like and what our culture sounded like, and I think that our cultures existed in between the art and the language, and during colonization, when both the art and the language were discouraged, our people had to internalize that sense of what it meant to be native. And I really admire people today who still have that sense of, being strong in their native identity, even though they don't have art around them, or even if they don't speak their language. But for people like me, I didn't have that. I had no idea who I was until I found the art and language. So I think what could help strengthen Northwest Coast Native art would be to focus on strengthening the art, but also focus on strengthening the language. So that middle ground where our culture lives will be a very strong foundation for our younger generations coming up.
Great answer. Well, now what am I going to say? Before I answer any more questions, I'll preface all of my answers are. I'm a real stickler for tradition, old style stuff. So I fully admit that every answer I'm going to have is biased toward that perspective. My dad brought me up to go study the old masters. I got to go to a lot of museums, and I spent a lot of time, in sketchbooks, just copying old designs to figure out form line, to figure out sculpture. Those are the best teachers. They're the guys that invented the system. They're the guys who made it work. And the work between 1780 and 1880 is still the greatest Northwest Coast art ever made, even including modern guys. And if any of them have a bit of humility, they'll agree with me. The old stuff is the best yet. Again, that's from my skewed, biased perception. So study of the old masters. That means access for our people to get in museums. When my dad first started doing this, museums, they'd let him into the collections, but they had to touch everything. We couldn't touch anything. They'd turn it over for us. They'd do everything. You don't get to do this. In my time, it's that in most places has changed, where you put on a pair of gloves and you go in, you get to touch whatever you want. I've even blown on an old whistle or two, probably risked arsenic poisoning just because I wanted to try it. So that's a big one. And because I'll specifically talk about formline in this because I'm a formline fanatic, and it's a very misunderstood system of art, even by our own people. Formline is as complicated as any other thing you can think of. It's not just a bunch of shapes thrown together. It works best when the guidelines are followed, because it is a system. And you can only learn that by starting from the ground up and working your way through it. So access to old collections, and not just for the artists. We talk about how do our communities value the art. There is a real lack of understanding from our own people about our art, about what's great, what isn't, because they haven't been exposed to it. Robert Davidson talked about when he was coming up, he went and looked through his community to find any old pieces. He found one old Bentwood box. Everything else, he had to go down to Vancouver or go to museums around the world to see any of it. And still to this day, even though there's been a flourishing of the resurgence of the art, there is a real lack of knowledge that our own people have. So how can our own people know what's good and value what's great, or raise the standard of the art, if when any Joe Schmo picks up an ads and knocks out a mask, that's, oh, it's gorgeous, oh, you know, it's not discounting their effort. That's not what I'm talking about. And I hope that's not how I come across. But the old art was valued in a way that I'm not sure we necessarily value it today. We're having to relearn what the art means to us and what it meant to the old people. Artists were, whether they were weavers or carvers, whatever, were these well-trained, well-taken care of people who were providing the objects that not only told your history, but explained why you owned certain things, why you could claim the grandness of your territory or whatever it was. So when we make pieces now for feasts and potlatches, that standard, sadly, that you see in galleries, the excellence that you see in the market, isn't always in our own villages. And I think that comes with education. Our people need to see what's possible. And I only say that because when you get to see the old pieces, when you go to museums and see rows and rows and stacks of these old masterpieces that blow you away, it's on par with anything that ancient Egypt ever came up with. So pushing for that standard also, but that doesn't mean that innovation can't happen. But the art is a system, and you have to learn the foundation before you can truly move on within the system, if that's what you're going to do, to something else. If you're just going to make art, the Western style of art, and have it have a Northwest Coast theme to it, that's different than being a Northwest Coast native artist who is functioning within the system of Northwest Coast art, northern Northwest Coast art, because once you leave Southeast Alaska, the art changes on the way to British Columbia. That's it. Education. Everybody needs to be educated. I'm sorry that was such a long answer.
Basa. Okay. Rico?
I think everybody else has already said it. I mean, there's the access to the foundational knowledge of the art is the most important thing. I think if I was to add something, I think I would say that maybe it's maybe marketing, so that awareness outside of our community is more global. So that one thing that I think all of us have done is gone to Indian market, and one thing that we find is that people aren't very familiar with the art form, and that's like one of the biggest native art markets in the world right now. So and even traditionally our people were sort of we're along the coast, so we're an access point for commerce along, from Alaska to south of Alaska. So I think, that gave us a lot of economic opportunity, kind of in that previous centuries that we should take advantage of today.
Sheesh. So thinking about museums, and there's this deep relationship between our people and museums and universities. I was at a NAGPRA training several years ago, and the trainer said there are more Native American remains, human remains, in museums and universities than there are Native Americans walking the earth today. And it's information like that, and to see all of these things that connect us. When we look at our art and that thing where, you can't touch it, like, it's part of us, and these concepts. I see my uncle in the back, he would tell us things, at-u, when that at-u comes out, you see your ancestors right there in front of you. And so there's a lot to that disconnection, which would lead us to the third question, That was the halftime show.
Come sit down in the back if they want
Oh,
to.
yeah, there's, you guys want to come sit, there's some spaces here, if you want to come sit down, you have to lean against the wall.
Long time to stay.
Can you pass the water too?
Oh, and we got water home. Now, this is the halftime show. Okay. Sheesh. The third question. And we'll start with Allison. What are the most difficult issues facing the art?
I think we've touched on quite a bit of the issues facing the art today, with lack of access to the old pieces. I know in Yakutat's not connected to the internet through the fiber optic cable, so it's very slow, and there are a couple promising artists there who would love to study the old pieces, they just can't. I think another issue we have is appropriation, of course. And this is getting into the next question, but I think our generation will be the one to deal with it the most, and that's technology. Our institutions are pushing for more education, and that's really good. But if they're educating everybody, I have to ask, and we don't have to solve it, but if they're educating everybody about this is how you do our art, will they also be the ones policing, coming in saying, sorry, you're not native, you can't do that down the road? And along the lines of technology, people have been really excited about 3D printing as a way to get our objects back. And it reminds me of canoes. You know, they transitioned from canoes to other boats because it was convenient and easy. And if our people are wanting to get our old pieces back through this very convenient, easy method, will we not end up sort of in the same boat down the road?
Well, again, access to education. It's hard in villages to get to go see pieces. There's lots of things online now. Like you said, is the internet quality available to make it worth your while? There's lots of museum collections that are online, but often the photographs are from one angle. Sometimes they're not of very good quality, and what they should do is take every piece and do a 360, that modern technology where you can turn it yourself digitally, around on the screen. But I mean, it takes a lot of money, a lot of time. So that's a big one. I think that, and this goes back to explain a little more what I said before, that the art, there's been a misinterpretation to a degree. Our art wasn't art in the Western sense. It wasn't just pretty to hang on a wall. And I think there's a lot of Northwest Coast art made today that is meant for that. I mean, obviously I make a living hanging my stuff on well-off people's walls. And there's always that dichotomy of how do I reconcile that I'm selling our art? And I have a few answers for that. One, it provides me the opportunity and time to go home and teach and make things for potlatches and do the things that I need to do at home. It makes my life freed up to be able to do that. Two, I look back at people like Charles Edenshaw, who, and before that even, I'm going to talk a bit about it in my class tonight. There's in Chief Shake's house, there's a killer whale screen that is, I think, stylistically, it's very similar to some Tsimshian house fronts in Prince Rupert. So I'm assuming the Tsimshian artist was hired to paint this screen for Chief Shake's. Happened all the time in the old days. So there was already this market, so to speak, for artists to be hired by other people to go do work for them. So that's not something that we've created with the art market that exists today. It's just there are more people buying it for non-traditional reasons. But I think, going back to what I said about it's not art, the willingness for people to treat it as free expression now, before learning the structure, takes something away, in my opinion, from the art. Because it's far more sophisticated than most people treat it. And that's not to say that I'm done, like I don't have all the answers. I'm still working every day to understand it better. But that idea that you can put, I'm as guilty as I designed a Superman S in Formline. So I'm as guilty of pushing that obscure boundary as anybody. But again, it's the struggle of making a commitment to the art itself. Making, as an artist, if you're going to choose to make that commitment to continuing the style and system that is Northwest Coast art. That is a decision that a lot of artists are either making or very clearly not making. And that's, personally, I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of so much art being produced that doesn't necessarily reflect the true sophistication of our art.
Rico? I think Allison mentioned appropriation. I think it's one that that we always can come back to, and that sort of also leads to a general public's appreciation for authenticity. I think a lot of people in the world appreciate authentic things, but I think a lot of people just kind of let it slide as well. So I think, how do we get more people to appreciate what is authentic? I think another difficulty is being able to have access to communities of artists as artists. It's important for us to be here together like this and talk. I think also, I think some of my biggest learning came from when I was working in a studio with other artists in it. That was just, there's just a synergy that just happens that you can't capture on your own. I think, and this one is sort of, it's a challenge that I think arises even from within our culture, is how we support the different genders within our arts. I think, I know Allison and my sister are both working on kind of representing women in Northwest Coast art, and I think I think you see less women in galleries, and that's just something that should be remedied. I think, one, to talk about sort of the idea of creating I think allowing laziness. A lot of what you're talking about is, I think we let a lot of artists get away with being lazy, and it's out of respect for the fact that they are trying to learn. But I think we need to be more rigorous.
Okay. Cheese.
Issues facing the art. There's so many potential variations of that. Personally, I think opportunity is always an issue. Having opportunity for our artists to make and create, and to teach and to share, and that goes down to even getting materials, etc. But funding's a major issue for art across the board, always. Having other issues facing Indigenous art is how it's stereotypically non-represented in the rest of the art world. Those are all larger issues, I think. Internally, issues facing our culture amongst ourselves is this peculiar space that David mentioned earlier of having being in a generation where we have a older generation that's holding on to things tightly, and for good reason, because a lot of the forced assimilation and the displacement, the removal, all of these things. So learning how to grasp culture, but do it in a way where you're not suffocating it for our own good and for our own sovereign growth, creatively and culturally. Those are all things that I think we negotiate. So.
Right. Sheesh. So some of the topics, just to sort of, some of my thoughts and some of the topics as well that I was hearing from my colleagues here who I admire tremendously is there's a lot that we've got to put on the table as well. We can't just talk about our arts. We've got to talk about the world that we live in. And that world is one that has come and displaced our people and taken from our people. Even I was living in the village of Kasan, and this was in 2005 and 2006, and people were still coming into the villages and just stealing things right out of the totem park there. They took the fin off of the killer whale. And I just remember how it devastates the community, because we keep asking, we say, when will this stop? When will it just stop? And there's other difficult dialogues that we have to engage in as leaders in our respective fields. And some of those would be, if we lined up every book along one of these walls, or maybe a longer wall, and this is every book that's ever been written on Northwest Coast art, how many of those were penned by an Indigenous hand? And those are some things that we need to look at, right? Because then we could have a much smaller, a little bookshelf over there. And those are some things, and we're challenged with changing that, but we also have to acknowledge we're in a system that tremendously privileges white folks. And then we've talked about appropriation, and that line between assistance and appropriation is always one that we've got to navigate as artists living in our communities. And other things are Migratory Bird Acts, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and these things that could actually limit us in terms of doing things that we used to do, and dealing with situations where it's typically not the indigenous population that has annihilated specific populations of animals. So this gets to our last question, then we'll have a question and answer period. And I'll start with David. What direction could the art be going, and where do you hope it does not go?
Well, I'll start with a story that my dad was carving a totem pole at the Seattle Center in 1988 for the Crossroads Continents show. And a man came up to him and said he was using a chainsaw to rough out this figure. He doesn't carve with it, but he just removes the wood he doesn't need. And the man said, "Using a chainsaw, huh? Your grandfather'd be ashamed of you." And my dad said, "Did you ride in here on a covered wagon? My grandfather bought me this chainsaw." Our people have always, if anything, Northwest Coast people are amazing at adapting and bringing in new technologies to make our lives better. We're not afraid to, the reason there are so many totem poles, old totem poles, was the introduction of iron and steel tools. The 1800s saw a shot in the arm for totem pole creation because it was easier then. And then they took it all away from us. But so I'm hoping that the introduction of an infinite amount of different media what Preston is doing with glass, digital things. That part is terribly exciting, because I think that's exactly what the old people would have done. Button blankets. Button blankets people think of them now as these traditional things. Well, we didn't have them until Europeans came and traded us blankets and buttons. Now they're as iconically Northwest Coast native as anything could be. We absorb things. I don't think of that as appropriation. There's a Charles Eatonshaw piece. It's a compote. It's a very Victorian era style thing, but it's this beaver bowl basically on this Victorian era looking stand with a figure carved on top, and that's Haida art. It's one of the most beautiful examples of Haida art that ever existed, but it is a complete owning of this new idea, and he made it as Haida as it could be. And I think that's an exciting thought for where the art could go. It's an infinite thing. It will grow like that, I hope, as we do things like save our languages, that the next generations coming up will not only be producing art in all these, in an infinite amount of ways, but they'll be doing it, I hope, I know you hope, also with speaking their own language and creating it once again. The thought that our people could once again create our art with our own languages as their first languages and seeing the world through those eyes is terribly exciting. And that's what we're all working towards. I mean, I just moved home to put my art on the back burner to help save our language. What I hope doesn't happen is it's a continuation of everything I've said earlier, that it doesn't matter what the art is or what it's done on, whether it's a computer or glass or wood or whatever. The quality that came along with the old masters is what needs to continue, no matter what we're doing. It doesn't matter how contemporary it is. If it's my Superman t-shirts or whatever, it should be held to the same standard as what our old people thought the old pieces would be. And that is still very much at risk, just as our language is at risk. It's all connected. And the other thing I hope that doesn't happen, because I think it is happening, whether we're in control of it or not, is that separation, that there's the art and then there's the culture over there. You can't do that. That's wrong when that happens, and it happens when it's appropriated by non-native artists who only do it to make a living. It's wrong when our own people do it and don't take the time to be a part of the culture themselves. I think the art is owed more than that. So I hope that doesn't happen, and I think as we continue to heal as a people, the peoples, the art will reflect that. And yeah, I think that's all. And I hope weaving and basketry starts to get its due like carving does. I think it's harder for women because the process is longer to gather those materials. Things have to be more expensive because that's a pain in the rear end to produce that stuff. But it's just as beautiful and just as worthy of gallery space as anything a man makes. Or if it's a man weaving or a woman carving. It's a new day that way. And I'm not a stickler anymore for whether or not it's a man or a woman. Just like I don't care who's speaking our language. We got to save it one way or another. So if we're doing it, it's great.
Sheesh.
I think if anyone had a chance to go see Steve Brown's lecture, I missed it, but I just watched it online the other day. There was a story that he told that I really liked. There's a house screen called the Brain Screen. It's pretty famous. You should look it up if you haven't seen it, heard about it. It's epic.
Yeah.
And I think I could use that word for it.
Properly used.
That
Yeah.
is- yes, absolutely.
So it's worth seeing. I think it's got an interesting history, though. What he talked about was that I think that screen was originally painted in around 1800, but it wasn't carved. And then around 1870, then it was another artist worked on it and added some carving to it. So, but the thing that Steve talked about was what the artist said, and some of the clues that he left behind. That he basically said it's a very nice piece, but he wanted to make some changes to it to make it a little more modern. So I think the idea of modernity isn't something that's new. There was always, us at some point in time thinking that, that something that we're looking at is a little old-fashioned. So I think I see, the direction that it could be going is what it's already going to be doing. Is we're going to be, us here, modern Native artists, being driven by kind of the foundations of our traditions and arts as modern people. I think I think personally, I think that when it comes to just specifically formline, I think, and the exploration of formline design, I think Robert Davidson is probably like the vanguard of what people are doing with Northwest Coast art. That's just my personal opinion, but I think he's very true to the form, but still very, very modern. He talks about a lot of things that happen, to us as people, but also us as a people in these modern nations. Where do I hope it doesn't go? I'm not too worried about that. I think I have a lot of faith in our people as artists. Yeah, there's a lot of the things that we talked about in difficulties, but those are things we're working on. So.
Jeez.
I'll be brief. The art can go wherever it needs to go, and it should do so. And I don't say that as in Jeremy Scott's Adidas clothing line and misappropriation, because it doesn't need to go there. But where it needs to go for us and our community, that's where it should be going. And as far as where I hope it doesn't go, I hope it doesn't go away, to be honest, and then also that our values underlying the connection of the art to the culture and the community, that does not go away either, because those are things that launch us into misappropriation and commercialization of culture, and those realities of existence solely on their own are not they're not the places that we want our culture to solely exist. So,
Sheesh. Elsa?
What direction could the art be going? I'm pretty optimistic with where the art is going, because our generation seems to be on the same page, and I've been listening to older generations, and everyone is talking about this push for quality, and I agree. So I think if that continues, we'll have a strong foundation. There's a really good presence of top quality art in galleries, but not so much in our home communities. So I think with this push for quality, our artists will be able to charge more, because the art is great and that's good, but our own people need to recognize the value in that, and we need to somehow figure out a way where this top quality art is also making its way back into the communities without the artists taking a huge pay cut because the art, is our visual link to the culture. It doesn't do the culture too much good if an artist is out there making quite a bit of money and just for themselves and not giving back to their community in any way. I'd also like to acknowledge being a female carver in a very male-dominated field. And I'd quickly say that all the men here I've known them to be very supportive, so I'm not talking about any of you. So, thank you. But I was talking to a curator, and they mentioned that it's so hard to arrange female carver shows because, and to quote pretty much exactly, because female carvers are always dropping off the map. And I thought, well, why? Why would a female carver put several good pieces in a gallery, look promising, and then, drop off the map after a year or two? And I think it comes down to children and the joy of raising a family. I've seen, in my experience at university, I was surprised to hear professors say in an academic setting, don't have kids, don't have kids if you want to be a successful artist. She could have been a great artist. I don't know what happened to her. I think she had kids. So I think if we feel the need to talk to women about that in an academic setting, we should change the message we're sending and not say, if you want to be successful, don't have kids. Instead, say something along the lines of, if you'd like to have kids, make sure you select a partner who is willing or even excited about sharing their half of the domestic responsibilities.
A lot of things to just ponder, living in this world that surrounds us now, this world that has come upon us, and it's impossible to ignore these different value systems that are around us. Money. There's so much about money, and carvers, they need to make money. I like to shop and buy from artists that I know and artists that I enjoy and support their work and their missions and what they do. But I also know that so many of our people live in poverty. So many things that I would like to see would be a restoration of the presence and strength of our clans, so that we can have monumental art among our clans. And now we have to rely on these larger and very capable and very generous organizations to do this for us. But then what does our clan have? And to see more clan-owned things, in Tlingit we call adu, being brought, so that the clan has this collection, the clan is wealthy as well, and to try to continue to challenge the world around us, which is capitalistic, which is born out of a lot of concepts that are really white supremacist, if you really think about them, and to continue to try and challenge those models and still be successful. And we do the same thing with our language students, because sometimes we tell them, we say, go down this road, you're probably not going to be a millionaire. You're not going to, you're not going to tell you go be a lawyer and go run big corporations. You'll make a lot more money. But this is your chance to really do something and to really create change. And I think all of these artists here that I'm standing among create change. And there's a question here that says, if you like anything to add, give you 10 seconds. Okay. Any questions or comments or thoughts?
I do have one thing
Okay.
I'd like to add. And I hope that this kind of thing will happen again in the future. And I would very much like to see, I'll say this out loud so the powers that be hear it, I would have liked for there to be a Haida on this panel today. There are plenty of young Haida guys. I mean,
Another Haida.
you're the moderator. T.J. Young or
Right.
somebody. I think that there's remembering to acknowledge those each of the tribes. Anga. And that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any? What's it?
I'd like to add
Okay.
something. I'd just like to quickly thank the Kwan and Taku Kwan people, and thank you to each of you for being here. You're all trailblazers in your own right. Thank you to everyone for coming, and I know we have at least an elder or two here, so I'd like to say that I hope that you feel that the art is in good hands now and not that you'll never be able to retire. So.
Jeesh. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
I'd just like to add that, we appreciate all of you delving into the form people call art today. I enjoyed your concepts and your ideas and what you learned from your dad. And I learned from my dad, not in the sense that like in school, but I probably crawled around in his shavings that you just watched and learned. And I learned from all the brothers. And some of you probably don't know, one of my older brothers, Horace Marks, he carved the strongman that's in Sealaska. And he did a piece for his father's people, my father's people too, Chukanidis, who's not the glacier. And I heard his mother talked about him doing this art piece. And like this at and he fasted before he started the work. And while he was doing the work, he fasted. Because this is, the reason was that it was a spiritual monument that he was creating, that had to be, he had to know the story behind that art piece. Or it's hard for it to get away from that word art when it's, our people call it Atgu, and spiritual beings that were created on wood or on chilkat blankets or from other things. And so I visited my older brother when he was up there in St. Anne's when they had a senior home there, and he shared with me, he says, Paul, our artwork is only not as high as it should be. He says, one, because the Russians took our best art pieces from us, so we have nothing to really clean from. And so it's not to our fault that we're struggling to really see the art form. And I don't perceive myself as a real defined artist, but I've studied by listening and by watching. And so I've carved 3 large totem poles. And people offered me, carve little totem poles and send them down to Chicago and we'll make big ones and you'd have so much money you wouldn't have enough pockets to fill your pockets with money. Well, it wasn't about money for me. And it didn't even last in my brain. I says, you know what you're talking about. Because I felt our art or our tool or what we do with our hands is more valuable than what money can really offer. I have art pieces in my room that I haven't finished, only because I meditate on it and I look at it and I said, there's got to be something that'll come out from me before I do it. And I understand that. I've done art pieces for a living. I made some good money out of it, but I just can't see carving for a commissioned art piece and you're put on a time limit. And it's no longer art to me. It's no longer a tool, because you have your creativity is to how long is it going to take me to carve this to that and get my piece done. Like Michelangelo, when he painted whatever, was he put on a time limit? No, he created it. And so your best art pieces will come when you take the time to do, as opposed to rushing to try to make something. And those pieces that you will do as you're growing for a living will develop into something you really want to create, or do you want to really leave behind to that future generation to see this was something done by a fine artist, an artist who studied and worked long hours to develop in his lifetime. Because a lot of art pieces come from when the elders were older, the best art pieces. My father was a traditional carver, his uncle was a traditional carver, and my dad's nephew was a traditional carver. And maybe some of you heard of him. His name is David Williams. He went to England to demonstrate his artwork. If you ever seen his artwork, you don't see that kind of artwork anymore. But I just want to say that you guys are all on the right track, and I was just kind of thinking, it's not like you guys were on trial and you were defending your position.
Good, that's how it felt. No, I'd like to add something to that. The idea of it not just being art, and the importance of that passing it on. I don't think in the old days that everybody could just be an artist. That's something that happens now. Oh, go be an artist. Well, not everybody's supposed to be an artist, and that's okay. People say, oh, I wish I could do that. Well, I say, well, I'm glad you can't, because I wouldn't have a job if everybody could, do it. Charles Edenshaw said his son, sadly, he said his son was better than him, but his son died when he was about 19. But he used to have his son come over when he'd wash his hands. He'd have his son put his hands underneath so that the water coming off of his hands would bless his son's hands to pass his abilities on to his son. I think that's an amazingly just beautiful gesture, and that idea that it's more than just splattering some paint on a canvas or whatever. It's more than that. And a great example is that for Tsimshian people in the old days, a carver who was making like a transformation mask or something very special for a potlatch that was only supposed to be seen when it was time for it to be danced. Otherwise it'd be put away in a bentwood box, or you never saw it. If someone were to walk in on that carver while they were creating this very secret piece, the carver could kill that person, because you didn't want it getting out what he was making. There was a great value to it, and
How many people have you killed?
Just put the do not disturb sign. I'm coming over.
I tell you, with Get On being the lead group next year, there's things we're making that we're trying desperately for no one to know about. Because we want to surprise everybody. So I get it. Sadly, we can't do that anymore. But
That's the change you want. See what I can do.
But I think it's a great example that it's more than art. It means something more, and it's that value. That value on it that I hope we're able to build back in our own communities, and that will make it so that an artist, there's gallery prices, and then there's home prices. And that sometimes that's dangerous, because it lets your own people think that it's not really worth what you're selling it for anywhere else. Well, we can get it for cheaper. Well, that doesn't help support what it's worth. In the old days, a chief who ordered a totem pole from somebody took care of that person for the entire time they were making the totem pole. For them and their family, they made sure they were fed and they were paid well. Now, when the pole went up, the chief didn't have to acknowledge the artist, because the artist's been paid. It was the chief's totem pole when it went up. So that's a little bit different now. I always appreciate when someone says this is by David Boxley, so that way, I get more orders. But anyway.
Just wanted to finish that, coming from an old family where a lot of our things were still being practiced. My dad took our fingernails in his son's, and he embedded them in his carving, so we become carvers.
Wow.
And this is what we call hecha. You mentioned that not everybody can become artists. Not everyone did hecha to be an artist.
Yeah.
There was Sejo done for a lot of different things, to be good fishermen, good hunters, to be hard workers, and so forth. So we had those, and it's a principle that's, I look at it as something just to encourage a person to delve into that particular area. So I appreciate you once again, and you guys are all innocent.
So the judge has declared us innocent. I know I saw another hand, but we got to wrap this up. I want to add one thing as a sort of closing thought, and I'll never miss an opportunity, or I'll never pass up an opportunity to advocate for our languages. And one of the things that the Dauenhauers speculated about with Tlingit, and I would apply the same thoughts to Haida, apply the same thoughts to Tsimshiat, is not only do you have to make sure the language is not preserved, but it's revitalized and it comes back to regular use in our communities, is you have to make sure it happens right away, because we're going to lose the complexity. We might survive, but we'll be talking like a bunch of little kids who don't understand the depth of metaphor and of grammar and the way that our ancestors see the world. And I would say the same thing about the art. I wouldn't want to see it just all boiled down to just ravens and eagles. The complexity of our stories, the complexity of our crests, the interconnectedness of our people. Sometimes I see people say, you can't use that, that's ours. And I understand how clan ownership works, but we used to put the things on our grandchildren. We used to say, you are our grandchild. We're going to show you in front of the whole world and show everybody how much we love you by putting these things on you. And so I'm very happy about the way things are going, but I want to just push everybody in this room, everybody that you know, you can do something about our languages, and you can do something, it's all interconnected. We're not compartmentalized like other things. It's an interconnected piece. And thank you guys for all of your comments.
Thank you, guys.
Cheesh, how, Deutschen.
If anyone would like to talk to us, I'll volunteer. I'll stick around if anybody wants to ask a question afterwards. So.
Thank you guys for coming. Thank you guys.
Thank you, guys.
for your time.